Number 1. William Francis Sutton, Jr.
He walked into banks dressed as a mailman, a window washer, a police officer. Nobody stopped him. Nobody suspected him. That was the point. Before he was the actor, before the disguises, before the folk hero headlines, William Francis Sutton Jr. was a Brooklyn kid who learned safecracking the way other boys learned a trade. He apprenticed under a professional thief. He worked. He got good. And in 1930, in Astoria, Queens, he committed his first bank robbery, walking out with cash and confidence in equal measure. He was arrested almost immediately, charged at one point with first-degree murder in the death of a man named Happy Gleason, a charge a jury ultimately rejected. Acquitted of that killing, Sutton went on to be convicted instead on robbery-related charges, and in 1931 he was delivered to Sing Sing to serve a sentence of 5 to 10 years. Sing Sing was not built to hold men like Sutton. It was built to punish them, but it assumed obedience it never got from him. For a year, he watched. He studied the walls, the guard rotations, the blind spots in a system built by men who believed no one could climb 30 feet of stone under watch. On December 11, 1932, he proved them wrong. Using a smuggled firearm, he took a guard hostage, secured a makeshift ladder, and scaled the wall into the dark. By morning, Willie Sutton was a legend.
What followed was a decade of robberies staged like theater. He wore a Western Union uniform. He wore a police uniform. He once walked past officers stationed specifically to catch him, dressed as one of their own. Newspapers dubbed him Slick Willie. The FBI eventually placed him on its most wanted list. He was captured, escaped again from Philadelphia's Eastern State Penitentiary, then years later from Holmesburg Prison, and captured once more, finally, in 1952, recognized by a tailor's son on a Brooklyn street. He would spend the rest of his working life defined by two things: the money he took and the walls he didn't stay behind. He always insisted he never fired a shot at another person during a robbery. Investigators never contradicted him. What makes Sutton's inclusion in Sing Sing's darkest chapters complicated is exactly this: he was never proven to have killed anyone. He was acquitted of the one murder charge brought against him. His danger wasn't violence, it was competence. A man who made the most secure institutions in America look like they were built for someone else. He died in 1980 in Florida, having spent roughly half his adult life behind bars and become, somehow, beloved for it. The unanswered question historians still debate: how many of his successful escapes were made possible not by his own ingenuity alone, but by guards who simply looked away?
Number 2. Julius Rosenberg and Ethel Rosenberg. 2 chairs, 2 death warrants, 1 marriage ended by the state in the same building on the same night. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were not murderers. They were convicted of conspiracy to commit espionage, passing information related to nuclear weapons development to the Soviet Union during the early years of the Cold War. But their execution remains one of the most consequential events in Sing Sing's history, and their case reshaped how America understood loyalty, secrecy, and fear itself. Julius Rosenberg was an engineer with Communist Party ties reaching back to his college years. Ethel, his wife, was drawn into the case largely through her brother, David Greenglass, a machinist who had worked at Los Alamos during the Manhattan Project. When federal investigators unraveled the Soviet spy network inside America's atomic program, Greenglass named his sister and brother-in-law to reduce his own sentence, testimony that would later be called into serious question, including by Greenglass himself, decades after the fact. The trial in 1951 unfolded against a backdrop of national panic. The Soviet Union had just tested its first atomic bomb. Senator Joseph McCarthy was building a career on the promise of hidden enemies. Into that climate walked the Rosenbergs, accused of handing away the one secret America believed kept it safe. The jury convicted both. The judge, Irving Kaufman, went further than sentencing guidelines required, calling their crime worse than murder and sentencing them to death, a punishment historians still consider disproportionate even among those who believe Julius was guilty. Ethel's role, in particular, has remained the subject of decades of dispute. Even some prosecutors later suggested she was charged largely as leverage to pressure her husband to naming other agents. He never did.
They spent 2 years on death row at Sing Sing while appeals climbed toward the Supreme Court and clemency pleas reached the White House. Global demonstrations called for mercy. Pope Pius XII appealed for their lives. None of it changed the outcome. On the evening of June 19, 1953, Julius was executed first. Ethel followed. Witnesses reported it took longer than expected. The couple left behind 2 young sons, Michael and Robert, who spent the rest of their lives fighting to understand exactly what their parents had and had not done. Declassified Soviet cable intercepts released decades later, part of the Venona program, appear to confirm Julius's involvement in espionage. Ethel's role remains far less certain, with several historians and even former prosecutors now suggesting she may have been convicted for a crime she did not substantially commit. The chilling, verified detail that still unsettles researchers: the U.S. government has never fully declassified every document related to the case, meaning even now, more than 70 years later, the full truth of what happened inside that marriage and that conspiracy remains incomplete.
Number 3. Ruth Snyder. The photograph is grainy, illegal, and unforgettable. A woman strapped into the electric chair, captured mid-execution by a hidden camera. It ran on the front page of the New York Daily News under a single word: inside. It remains one of the most infamous images in American criminal history, and the woman in it was Ruth Snyder. Before she became a tabloid legend, Snyder was a Queens housewife married to Albert Snyder, an art editor more devoted to his deceased former fiancée's memory than to his own wife. The marriage was, by every account, unhappy. In 1925, Ruth began an affair with a corset salesman named Henry Judd Gray, a quiet, unremarkable man who would become, in the words of prosecutors, entirely remade by her influence. Together, they plotted. Ruth took out life insurance policies on her husband, including one with a double indemnity clause for accidental death, a detail so specific it would later inspire the plot of the film noir classic, Double Indemnity. On the night of March 20th, 1927, Gray entered the Snyder home while her husband slept. Albert Snyder was killed. The scene was staged to resemble a burglary gone wrong. It didn't hold up. Investigators found the stolen jewelry hidden in the house. Ruth's story kept shifting. Within days, both she and Gray had confessed, each attempting to place the greater blame on the other, a dynamic that would define their joint trial and captivate the entire country.
The Snyder-Gray trial became a media sensation unlike anything New York had seen. Reporters dubbed it the dumbbell murder for what they characterized as its clumsy execution. Damon Runyon covered it, so did a young Ring Lardner. The courtroom was packed daily, with spectators treating the proceedings like theater. Both defendants were convicted and sentenced to death. Ruth Snyder went to Sing Sing's death row, still maintaining, in fragments, that Gray had acted alone, even as evidence made clear her role in planning the murder. On January 12, 1928, she became one of the few women ever executed in New York State. A Chicago Tribune photographer, Tom Howard, smuggled a small camera strapped to his ankle into the execution chamber and captured the moment of her death. A breach of protocol so significant it changed how executions were witnessed and photographed for decades afterward.
Her case did more than end two lives. It reshaped tabloid journalism, inspired one of Hollywood's defining crime films, and forced New York to rewrite the rules governing who could witness an execution and with what equipment. The detail that still unsettles historians: the photograph exists at all only because a journalist broke the law to take it, and no one was ever meaningfully punished for it.
Number 4. Louis Lepke Buckhalter. He is the only major American crime boss in history to be executed for murder. Not for tax evasion, not for racketeering, for murder. Ordered, organized, and proven in court. Louis Buckhalter began as a street thief on the Manhattan's Lower East Side, robbing pushcarts as a teenager. By the 1930s, he'd built something far more dangerous, a criminal enterprise generating an estimated $50 million a year through extortion, narcotics, and labor racketeering. To protect it, he created an enforcement arm that would become one of the most feared instruments in American organized crime, a dedicated squad of contract killers, later known publicly as Murder Incorporated. Buckhalter didn't just tolerate violence, he industrialized it. Murder, Inc. operated with the discipline of a business, dispatching hitmen across state lines specifically to avoid local jurisdiction, ensuring killers had no personal connection to their targets. Investigators would later estimate the organization was responsible for anywhere from dozens to several hundred killings over the course of the decade. His downfall began the way so many organized crime empires end, from the inside. As prosecutors, most notably a young, ambitious Thomas Dewey, closed in on the syndicate's operations, members of Buckhalter's own crew began cooperating with authorities to save themselves. The case that finally brought him down was the 1936 murder of Joseph Rosen, a garment trucker who Buckhalter believed intended to testify against him. Rosen was shot to death in his Brooklyn candy store. Buckhalter went into hiding for 2 years, reportedly negotiating his eventual surrender through intermediaries who believed federal authorities would treat him more leniently than New York State prosecutors. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. He surrendered to the FBI in 1939, was convicted in the Rosen murder in 1941 alongside associates Emanuel Mendy Weiss and Louis Capone, and after years of appeals, reaching all the way to questions of federal versus state jurisdiction, all three were sentenced to die. On the night of March 4, 1944, Sing Sing's electric chair took all three men in succession. Weiss went first, declaring his innocence to the end. Buckhalter followed minutes later, composed, silent, offering no final statement. Witnesses described him walking to the chair with what one reporter called a brisk, almost defiant step. His execution effectively ended the era of Murder, Inc. as an operating enterprise and sent an unmistakable message through organized crime. Even the men who ran the killing machines were not above the machine of American justice. The verified detail that still chills investigators who studied the case: from his cell in the years before his execution, Buckhalter reportedly continued to order the deaths of men he believed might testify against him, meaning his organization kept killing on his behalf even after he had lost his freedom entirely.
Number 5. Albert Fish. By the time Albert Fish sat down in Sing Sing's execution chamber, investigators, psychiatrists, and reporters had spent months trying to answer a single question no one could fully resolve. How does a quiet, elderly house painter become one of the most disturbing figures in the history of American crime? Fish was by every outward measure unremarkable. A soft-spoken grandfather who worked odd jobs and moved quietly through New York City for decades. What lay beneath that surface would not become clear to authorities until 1934, when a letter arrived at the home of a family whose child had vanished 6 years earlier. The letter described in explicit and horrifying detail what had happened to their daughter. It also contained a detail so specific that investigators were eventually able to trace its origin, a stationary mark leading them, improbably, back to Fish himself. His arrest exposed a case that had haunted investigators since 1928, when a young girl disappeared from her Manhattan family's apartment after Fish, posing as a laborer offering work to her father, was allowed to take her to what he claimed was a birthday party. She was never seen alive again. What followed his arrest was one of the most extensively documented psychiatric examinations in American criminal history. Doctors who evaluated Fish described a man whose interior life bore almost no resemblance to his exterior calm, a lifetime marked by documented institutionalization as a child, self-inflicted injuries, and disturbing personal writings that he himself provided to examiners with unsettling openness. Multiple psychiatrists diagnosed him with severe psychiatric illness. The jury, having heard that testimony, convicted him anyway, finding him legally sane enough to stand trial and bear responsibility for his actions.
The trial drew national attention, not for spectacle, but for genuine horror. Reporters and jurors alike struggled to reconcile the frail, elderly man in the courtroom with the case being described. Fish reportedly showed little emotional reaction throughout the proceedings, at times seeming almost detached from his own trial. He was sentenced to death and moved to Sing Sing's death row, where prison staff and psychiatric personnel continued to study him, producing case notes that would later become foundational reading in forensic psychiatry, an unusual, uncomfortable legacy for a man whose crimes defied easy classification even among the professionals trained to understand them. On January 16, 1936, Albert Fish was executed. Accounts from witnesses at the time noted that the execution reportedly took longer than typical, attributed by some present to old surgical scarring, a detail Fish himself was said to have remarked on beforehand in the same detached tone that had unsettled examiners for 2 years. The question that has never been fully answered, even by the psychiatrists who spent the most time with him, whether Albert Fish's crimes were the product of the severe illness so thoroughly documented in his case file, or a calculation hidden underneath it, a distinction the state ultimately decided didn't change what he owed for what he'd done.